My name is John, and this is our speech on gun control and universal background checks. The problem, everyone agrees that gun violence in America is a problem that needs to be solved one way or another. The solution to this problem, though, is a hot topic of debate on how to solve it, and every solution that people come up with has its pros and cons. Our group will talk to you today about universal background checks, which is one solution that has pros and cons that we will discuss, and we will also discuss several interest groups' positions on the solution as well as its constitutionality.
So here are some of the pros of universal background check. So the current system of universal background checks in the United States is that it's not universal. So then some states who have it, like California, if someone can't buy a gun in there, they can just head on over to another state and try again. So there are a lot of different studies done on gun control where they can't really give real results because of some laws in place, but according to the U.S. Department of Justice, the federal law fails to require background checks by every person who sells or transfers a gun, as stated by John earlier. Individuals prohibited by law from processing guns can easily obtain them from private sellers and do so without any federal records of the transactions. So pretty much, like I described earlier, they can just go to another state or go to a private seller and then there's no records of sale or transaction. One of the solutions is using the already in place system, the NICS, or the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that is operating in the US already. And then we can just, be universal. So the current problem with the gun control position is that people who have guns aren't supposed to have guns, and people who aren't supposed to have guns can still acquire guns. So one of the solutions to that is a background check. But the problem with just normal background checks is that, as stated before, you can just go to another state and just try again. That's why we need universal background checks. So there are currently 11 states that have the universal background check system in place. This includes California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Nevada, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Washington. The Hill in February 2013 ran a poll asking gun owners if they would be okay with universal background checks when they were purchasing weapons. And they said that 92% of gun owners want universal background checks.
So for cons for background checks, according to the Declaration of Independence, God-given rights are unalienable, and the government can't infringe or delay those rights from law-abiding citizens. According to the Second Amendment, every citizen has a right to own and bear firearms. So it's a God-given right and it's unalienable. So the government installing a bureaucratic system that will delay the ownership of guns for law-abiding citizen is an infringement upon that right. Background checks also invite official abuse. So officials could deny you your background check, requiring you to appeal to find out the reason, and they could use any reason they want, and you would have to go through a difficult process to overturn their decision if they just chose to not pass your background check. An example of that is a lady was denied her background check, and the cited reason was her age and gender, which are not restrictions under the current laws to keep you from getting a gun. Background checks are also ineffective for stopping criminals because they can easily bypass the background checks with fake IDs and going through a third-party buyer. They could have someone buy the gun for them. So as far as keeping the guns out of criminals' hands, this is not an effective method. Background checks can and do lead to gun registration. So using background checks, you can track who buys guns and then keep a list of who owns the guns. So it is a roundabout way to get gun registration. The FBI has admitted that they keep track of gun purchases for up to 6 months. Gun registration can and does lead to the confiscation of firearms. And the courts have ruled that prior restraints on rights are unconstitutional. And would we tolerate background checks on other rights? If you have the right to do something, you shouldn't have to go through a lengthy bureaucratic process just to achieve the right that is yours. Also, with universal background checks, it only keeps law-abiding citizens from getting guns. Criminals do not get their guns through legal means. They usually steal them and or buy them illegally. So universal background checks would keep the guns out of law-abiding citizens' hands. It would not stop crime.
So the Supreme Court involvement, the District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008 and 2010, which upheld the fundamental right to keep guns at home for self-defense. When the court struck down a Washington, D.C. ban on handguns, which it followed in 2010 by overturning a similar Chicago law. Since then, justices have refused to hear challenges from gun rights or gun control groups. That has left issues such as assault weapons bans, trigger locks, and the right to carry guns in public up to individual states. The justices held that the amendment protected the right of individuals to own guns for self-defense. Kavanaugh joining the Supreme Court could tip the scales. He firmly believes in protecting the Second Amendment gun rights. The Second Amendment, the basic right to own guns is firmly established in constitutional law. The Second Amendment doesn't represent the gun itself, but the person behind it. The federal circuits can't even agree on how to evaluate Second Amendment challenges, let alone what the result should be. And even if the Second Amendment did protect an individual's right to bear arms for self-defense, it should be interpreted to allow the government to ban handguns in high-crime urban areas.
So the one thing all people in the United States agree with is gun violence is an issue. But the one thing we don't agree on is what the solution is. But as we brought up today, one solution is universal background checks. And there are pros and cons to that system. Some people think it could work and will work. Some people think it will never work and it will just end up violating our rights. On the supporting side, the main argument comes from the fact that non-universal systems that are in place right now just can't and do not work. We talked about how these systems create loopholes that allow criminals to just get guns anyway. An example would be in a state like California, or one of the other 10 states that have a universal background check system. A criminal may not be able to acquire a gun, but all they have to do to legally get a gun is drive to the next state that doesn't have the same system, and they're free to do whatever they want. That's why the pro side argues a universal background check system is necessary, because background checks only truly work when they are universal, because these loopholes could not exist. But not only would a universal background check solve those issues, the pro side argues that 92% of gun owners support a universal background check system. So not only would we be creating a solution to this problem, it wouldn't have much dissent, which we can't say about gun control in the United States very often. But just because there is support and there is potential that this solution could work, there are just as many arguments that it couldn't. When we get to the dissenting side, the first main arguments come from the Second Amendment, which is, where most gun control arguments come from. We have a right to defend ourselves, and the government cannot infringe on that right. While a universal background check system may solve these problems, it also would create other issues as well. Some of those issues that were mentioned are the abuses on power that have and could continue to happen under a system like this. Also, it would create a database of gun owners which infringes on people's right to bear arms and could lead to the confiscation of firearms. It's understandable why people who do not support universal background checks could see these things happening and want to prevent them at all costs. But not only could these things happen, they argue that a universal background check system may just never work because criminals could get guns anyway. There are studies that have shown that most guns used in crimes were actually stolen or not bought legally at all. So a universal background check system wouldn't actually reduce crime rates. It would just take guns away from people who are using them to protect themselves, and criminals would still have weapons to commit crimes with. The last thing we have to look at after the pro and the con is just where does this stand constitutionality? And where has the Supreme Court ruled in terms of gun control? Well, as was mentioned in Heller versus District of Columbia, they said that people are allowed to keep handguns at home to defend themselves. But they've left most gun control besides that up to individual states. And some argue that that's the reason our background check systems don't work, and that's the reason gun control is so hard, because it's not uniform. But some people also argue that individual states deciding gun control is necessary because every state's different. A state like California or Washington does not have the same relationship with guns as South Dakota, Nebraska, or states where people are raised around guns and know how to use them from a really young age. But regardless, a solution is yet necessary. A universal background check system may be one of those solutions, and it may not be. But that's up to the states, and that's up to the people who vote within them, so, yeah.
We're short, like 2 minutes, we could just add blooper reel. This is our, oh my fucking god.
That's fine.
God-given rights are unalienable. Alright, I'm starting over.
I'm not alone.
Let's go.